What's up guys, welcome back to Elderwood Games. This week we're talking about the changes to the fight phase. In a Warcom article this week, they broke down the fight phase even further and even gave us a little bit more information about what changes to fights first will happen, changes to engagement range, as well as exactly how the new charging mechanic, I guess you could say, is going to work, because it is going to be quite different. And I think there's some important talking points here that we'll discuss today. Firstly, engagement range is now going to be 2 inches from our models, which I think is actually a pretty good change. It stops the like base to base kind of deal where you could have something that's pretty far out if the bases are big enough, but it also just sort of simplifies it, makes that a bit easier. It also seems that this 2-inch engagement range may also help with the kind of, oh, I'm going to be an inch off the wall so that way you can't properly charge me. And it's just going to break off a lot of those like really unnecessary kind of gotcha sort of moments, but also just it makes it feel a lot cleaner. It's just going to, I think the changes that we're going to discuss a little bit more today are ultimately going to make the charge phase feel a lot more straightforward and just make it feel a lot better for everyone that's involved. An important note about this 2-inch engagement range is you will now be able to move through engagement range with models, but you cannot end a move within engagement range, similar to how a lot of vehicles and stuff work currently. It's just a nice little change, and it's going to make it so that way there's not this like awkward 2-inch bubble around everything, making movement screens a lot more difficult. And I guess there's some truth there as well, that I think some move screening may be a little bit harder, which could be a good thing, and you won't be able to lock people into certain areas as easily. But more of that to come. It just says you can move through engagement range. I don't know if that's going to mean moving through a unit, and there may be some further definitions coming down the line to more iron that out. So as we know, the charge phase is changing. One of the things that they released or spoiled kind of during the big event was that you will now be able to choose your charge targets after a charge roll is made. And this article actually breaks down a bit further of what that exactly means, because it is a little bit different than how charges work currently in 10th edition. So let's kind of talk about that now. I'm basically going to go through the chart that is in that article. You can find the article linked in the description below, but also here is the chart that I'll be referencing. When you're making your charge move, so after you've determined your bubble, you determine the unit or units that you are going to be charging, this is what you have to do when you are moving those units. Each model in the unit must end closer to the eligible charge targets. So you have to move closer to that from where you were currently. They may break down that a little bit further, but in the rules as intended, that would mean that all your models are moving in the direction toward that charge target. So instead of doing kind of what people do currently, where they sort of may fan out to be able to kind of move block and kind of consolidate into some other things, it's not as easy, I don't think, in 11th edition to do that. The next part is that each model that can move within 1 inch of one or more of the charge targets must do so. So this also means that you must move as close as possible, and if from where they started to where they end up, they could have moved within 1 inch of the charge targets, they have to move there. So unfortunately, this is probably going to be somewhere that people try to manipulate the rule a bit, or they may kind of move without kind of measuring and that sort of thing. So it does seem like this might be somewhere where, unfortunately, as a defending player, you are going to have to kind of babysit and watch those movements, just because I can see this being a potential place where, unfortunately, some people may decide to, intentionally move in ways that isn't kind of rules as intended. And lastly, to further this, each model that can end its move engaged with the charge target must do so. That means within 2 inches of the target, they must do so. So similarly, I know a current kind of strategy, if you will, is you kind of charge everything in so that everything kind of blocks the movement within base-to-base contact of the charge target, and then you can kind of move the other ones sort of spread out and around. Now it's basically everything has to move in and be able to be like within engagement range, which, because now engagement range, the bubble is a bit bigger, I think that we're going to see far fewer of the sort of consolidations and like purposely charging in ways to kind of negate certain abilities from other nearby models. But there are a few interesting changes to how pile-in and consolidate work, and we'll talk about those in just a second. So that's kind of how you have to move, and then after you finish your move, there's a few other caveats that have to be true in order to properly finish this charge. Firstly, your charging unit must be within engagement range of all charged targets. So that means that you have to be careful which charged targets you pick, because you have to be able to be within engagement range of each of them in order to successfully complete the charge. So this could mean potentially walking back some movements if you were to end up in a position where you fail that, or more importantly, while you are moving in a way that meets this criteria. Another important note is that your unit cannot be engaged with any other units that are not your charge targets. So that means they have to be outside of 2 inches of anything that wasn't declared as a charge target during your charge phase. So this will kind of mean, like, if there's a few kind of scrunched units, you might have to declare a secondary unit as a charge target just so you can get all of your units in to engagement with your primary target goal, just to make sure that you can get in there and not have to worry about engagements with other things. It sounds like you still kind of get to pick and choose where your fights go into, so you can choose to kind of do everything into your primary target, but just a heads up there, that will mean that you'll likely need to carefully pick, and unfortunately you will likely have to end up in engagement with something else that'll be able to fight back into you, which we may talk about in a sec. And then lastly, similar to 10th edition, the unit that charges gains the Fights First ability, which will kind of go into now kind of how the Fights First rule is going to change, because sort of how activation works is going to be a little bit different. So let's kind of move through the rest of this article and go into the next bit. So reading a little bit further in the article, basically when you're charging, if a unit can end within 1 inch of your charge target, they must do so, but they can, if a model cannot make it within 1 inch, as long as it can end within 2 inches, it must do so. There is likely going to be scenarios where something is going to be outside of engagement range, but the rules are written in a way that means that everything that can must move and end within engagement range of 1 or more charge targets in the charge phase. It also does specifically call out the quote, "I'm going to stand 1 inch away from the wall" malarkey. Their words, not mine. So that was a concern of mine at the beginning, but they distinctly call it out here, so that's just an interesting call out from them. They also have this pretty helpful chart, and I'll just go ahead and put that up now, that sort of shows an example of a charge phase and sort of shows the bubble that I was talking about and kind of how you move within it, which ones could be selected, and even the one that technically your bubble is within engagement range of an outside unit, but because the unit itself is not within that bubble, you're not eligible to charge that unit, which I find really helpful, and I think that's going to clear up a lot of confusion considering the way that 10th edition works currently. Another interesting change is ingress moves, which includes deep strike and arriving from reserves. Now, instead of 9 inches, you can go within 8 inches. So for those of us with 18-inch Meltas, we are able to land within Melta range, at least for now. You know, they could change that. Obviously, that's one reason why some of the stratagems that let you drop outside of 3 got changed to 6 because of some of the Melta stuff. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what can really benefit from that. But it is a call out that even they alluded to in the article. So I just want to bring that up. Next up is pile-in moves. So they sort of mentioned this before, that the pile-in and consolidate are going to be different for this edition, and they break it out here. So basically, pile-in is going to happen at the start of the fight phase. So before anything actually fights, the active player, the player whose turn it is going to be able to make all of their pile-in moves for all units that are eligible to fight in that phase. And then their opponent will make their pile-in moves. So crucially, that means that everything piles in all at the same time, and then we fight. I think this is a good change, and there is an interesting mechanic that they mention in a second. But this will kind of make sure that everyone understands what's fighting where, and it's also going to be crucial even knowing about sort of the upcoming movement change, that you're choosing where your stuff is piling in and making sure that it all gets within engagement range and that sort of thing. So fighting's going to work basically how it does now. However, it's going to be alternating through both the fights first and the regular fights kind of phases within the fight phase. And the player whose turn it is will get the first fight. So basically we will have fights first. Active player whose turn it is going to be able to select a fights first unit on their side of the table to fight first. Their opponent will be able to choose a fights first unit if they have any to fight next. And then they will alternate back and forth until all fights first units have fought. This is different than 10th. In 10th edition, basically the fights first phase is everything with fights first on the opposing team gets to fight first. Then the active player, all their fights first goes. And then the active player gets to, then the defender player gets to fight with their thing first. And then you alternate back and forth in the standard fights phase. So it is a change. So in 11th edition, we'll basically have the fights first phase where the active player will be able to fight with a fights first unit first. The opponent will be able to fight next with a fights first unit from the active, non-active, and you go back and forth until all fights first units have fought, even if that means there are multiple activations from one player after the other player has finished activating fights first units. Similarly, when you get into the standard fights phase, this is where it changes slightly, because basically the player that would have activated next in the fights first phase activates first in the standard fights phase. So that's how the fight phase is kind of broken down. And in the fight phase, there's also a new type of fight. So there is a normal fight, which happens in fights first and in the standard fights phase. There's also an overrun fight. And this is an interesting one. So basically, if a unit started the fight phase engaged with a unit that has been destroyed, it is eligible to make an overrun fight, which allows it to move up to 3 inches toward another unit and be able to fight that unit as if it had started the phase fighting with it. There's an interesting design space here. Obviously, there could be some things that allow a further movement, getting +2 to your overrun fight, getting some additional bonuses on overrun fights. But because this is done basically after fights first is declared, I don't think there would ever be an instance where this unit would be eligible to basically gain fights first and fight and sort of interrupt. But that is to be seen. There could be stratagems around that potentially. But let's just talk maybe a little bit further in depth of exactly how this works, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'll actually kind of flag up the sort of graphics that they have, because I believe that these are going to be really helpful. So there's the normal fight. Players alternate selecting units to fight. Fights first units must be selected before any other eligible units. The red player selects their monster to fight. It makes a normal fight, destroying the transport. The embarked units makes an emergency disembark move. After doing so, it is unengaged. So it's outside of engagement range of all enemy models, which is the smart thing to do, at least in 10th edition. However, an overrun fight is eligible to happen. The blue player has no fights first units, so the red player selects their next unit. The red player selects another fights first unit. This unit is unengaged, but was engaged with the transport at the start of the fight step, so can make an overrun fight. It first makes a pile-in move to engage the unit that disembarked, then fights, destroying 2 enemy models. The blue player unit fights back, but inflicts no damage. Because why would you let sisters hurt stuff, I guess. That's kind of how the overrun move works. I think this is ultimately a good change. It will be a little bit frustrating, I think, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a it's going to be part of the rules, obviously, so it's going to take some time to get used to, I think, because a lot of us are kind of used to, oh good, the transport was destroyed, I'm able to disembark outside of engagement range. So these guys are going to be safe, but now it's not so good because things are going to be able to kind of get in close. So sort of surrounding transports is going to be a very valid strategy and one that a lot of people should be using. And then, just like in this previous example, getting a beefy monster that can really punch into transports and a unit that's going to be better served taking out the infantry, getting both of those on a transport to be able to basically have the monster destroy it and then the infantry kind of pile in and kill whatever comes out is going to be a really good strategy. And it's already kind of a good strategy to basically make it so your opponent has to disembark and still be within engagement range of one of your other things. But now it's basically like even harder to escape the combats and that sort of thing. So interesting change. Ultimately, I think it'll be good, but I also think it's going to be a little bit frustrating for some people that may miss kind of this being a thing for this edition before getting it to games and that sort of thing. So lastly is consolidate. It sounds like this works just the same as pile in, and that you would basically do the active player would do all of theirs and then the non-active player would do all of theirs. They don't specify, so in 10th edition you have to basically consolidate towards the next eligible enemy, and if you cannot do that, you are eligible to move toward an objective if you're able to end within engagement range or within range of that objective. This one words it a bit differently, so I don't know if they're making it to where basically models can just move 3 inches and have to move closer to the eligible things, or if it's still going to be if you decide to make a consolidate move, you have to move within engagement range of a close enemy unit. And if you cannot do that, you can move within scoring range of an objective marker and that sort of thing. It doesn't specify, so there's a little bit of kind of speculation there, but I believe that they're not going to change it too much, and they do call out in the article to be careful because if you do consolidate into a unit that has not fought, that unit will be able to fight before the fight step officially ends. So a lot of stuff in this article, but I think a lot of really helpful stuff. And I think ultimately these are going to be overwhelmingly good updates. I think having sort of this charge bubble makes it a little bit more risky for like long bomb charges. Now like the true 12-inch charge isn't actually possible. Like it said in the article, a unit must be within 12 inches of it. It's not that you can technically end the charge within, like if you roll a 12, you end within the proper kind of thing to get there. Now it is, they have to be within range. And I think that eliminates a lot of the guesswork and a lot of the like, well, like to get within, half an inch, you have to be, you have to get a 7 or you have to get an 8 because technically you're just outside of like 7.5. And there's just a lot of like weird kind of calculations happening. And now it's just a lot more streamlined. It's just like, this guy's going to charge. I rolled 2d6. I rolled an 8. What units are within 8 inches of this model? Okay, 2 units are within 8 inches. I have to move towards them. All the stuff has to end within an inch if possible. Everything has to end within engagement range if possible. And then when we get to the fight phase, it piles in. And it's just that easy. There's not as much kind of finagling with movement rules and that sort of thing. And also piling in requires them to get closer to the closest enemy unit. So I think there's going to be a lot less of the like, oh, I'm going to tag into this other unit that I didn't actually charge. I'm going to like, and that sort of thing. Like some of the sort of, I guess you could call it movement shenanigans of like 10th edition. That while I think they're valid strategies and they are a way to use the rules for an advantage, I don't think they were rules as intended. And I think that they are progressing the rules in a way to make it more rules as written being how it should be, and basically making it so that it's not rules as interpreted, it is, or rules as intended, it is rules as written, this is what you have to do, and there's no kind of like way to get around it. And I think it's ultimately going to make games better because there's going to be less of this like, well, actually, like, it can work this way. The rules technically say I can't do this, so I am going to do it this way. And while there are some cases where maybe that's fine, I think a lot of times it gets weaponized in a negative way in sort of the 40K community. So take that kind of with a grain of salt. It's sort of like my opinion on it. Obviously, you guys may have differing opinions, and I'd love to hear about that down in the comments below. But what do you think about the updates to the charge and the fights phase? Ultimately, I think that these are good changes, and I think it clears up a lot of sort of the fogginess of the current 10th edition rules and makes it a lot harder for people to take advantage of sort of the looseness of the rules, and sort of irons it out in a way that makes it much more coherent and cohesive and makes it feel much more kind of confident that you can kind of speak against when someone may be trying to take advantage of you or other newer players. But definitely let me know what you think down below, and tell me that I'm wrong, tell me that I'm right. I appreciate all the feedback and criticism and all that comes with wonderful YouTube comments. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.